Now today we have a slightly different episode of Boys Bleed Publishing, the publishing company headed by writer and artist Sandro Sebastian. I want to talk a little bit more about the benefits of reading and discuss classic eras of literature by stating first, what this part of our psychology is and how the difference between intaking a work of literature and perhaps watching a television set or listening to pop music, and how one doesn't really replace the other or upstage the other. Because in the sense that when you're listening to someone handcraft a work of art right in front of you, you're not only intaking what's immediately right in front of you, the sentence that's immediately in front of you, but you're feeling it illuminate all the sentences that came before it, so it kind of builds up. And then at the end you have a crafted sculpture of a work of art in your mind, whether it's made of words or it's made of strokes on a canvas or made of notes in a melody in the song. You see what I'm talking about, right? That's not the same thing as something that's moving down a mechanical assembly line on a conveyor belt where every moment is exactly like the one before it, like when you're watching television or listening to mass-produced pop music where you're just waiting for something amusing to happen. Then, the same stuff happens for a while on that conveyor belt, then something amusing happens, and then they just want to make sure that something amusing happens at least every couple of minutes to make sure that you do not change the channel on the commercials. That's so, and we start to take that attitude out there into our daily lives, and it just makes a lot of things in life more difficult. There is such a thing as slowing down and learning how to see past the part of our lives that we're just living off the top of our head, which is what that corporate produced rubbish is. It's just the part of our lives we're living on autopilot off the top of your head. We have to think about, is this really what people actually are, though? And is this what a human life actually is? Or the other way of describing that content is like if you take a picture and put it face down in a copy machine, and the copy machine generically spits out another one, instead of an artist handcrafting something, so that you're left with a complete sculpture in your mind that illuminates a part of your identity. And we can also say the same thing about adult life. Now, when you're young and you're living at home with your parents and the only adults outside of your family you spend time with are instructors and teachers and mentors that are legally required to look after you and foster your development, life looks like a certain kind of phenomenon from that perspective. You have certain values that only work when that is your social situation, the grown-ups that are legally required. So certain parts of your adult personality haven't developed yet. There's nothing wrong with you, you're just not there yet. No one is. So as you leave your parents' home and you spend more time around adults that are less and less legally required to look after you, and you have to kind of conduct yourself and find your confidence, you get a chance to explore new parts of your personality that, like on the fly for the very first time, and it shapes your image of yourself in your head slowly. So it's almost like you're feeling, like when you're reading literature, you're feeling one sentence illuminate all the sentences that came before it, and it's taking you somewhere and adding up to something greater than the sum of its parts. You're in your 20s now. As I say about what is special about your 20s, your 20s are the only decade of your life where society expects you to act like an adult when you've never done this before. So your personality has to kind of take shape, and then in your 30s, which is the first decade where you can act like an adult when you've had a decade to practice, and then your 40s is the first decade where you've had a decade that's not just practice, because the 20s was your practice, you see? So it's almost like no 2 decades in your life are the same. And then if you have kids, get married, that's a whole nother series of adventures right there. But you see, there's no reason to look at life as a mechanical assembly line, like every moment is exactly like the one before it, and every now and then something amusing happens, something amusing. And remember, amusing is not the same thing as enlightening. But you're not going to think about that while watching television. And then there are parts of your identity that have to figure out how to feel appropriate about themselves so that you do not fall into despair and resort to self-destructive or unhealthy coping methods. And there are questions that you have to ask about how being a grown-up works that you didn't think to ask when you were younger because certain things were not an issue before. Now that I have to learn how to think like an adult, it's a matter of my safety. Like what do I, not just how do I pay my bills and how do I make sure I don't starve to death, but how do I decide when someone is lying to me or manipulating me or brainwashing me? It's not as though people don't have a reason for doing that. What do I do when the bad guys try to take advantage of me or intimidate me? What if there are certain kinds of bad guys that they don't teach about in schools or my parents have never heard of? What if I have life experiences that my parents didn't have because the times were different back then and they didn't face these kinds of challenges? What do I do? So you need to be someone that's not afraid to be spoken to like an adult. Is there a way of practicing this? Is there a way of practicing learning this and building up your inner personality, your inner adult personality, other than just in a way that's more structured and organized than just wandering out there and getting your butt kicked, which is going to happen no matter what. But let's see if we can't shine a little insight and sell my product here about what I do. So I was in another part of town recently running an errand, and because I didn't want to sit in traffic, I decided to stay on that side of town until later in the evening when traffic dies down. So I looked for a library. The only one open was actually a university library that let people walk in. I couldn't check out any books because I didn't have a student ID. But I did sit down and I said, okay, what author do I default to when I just want to sit there and read for a little bit, but I don't have to walk out with the book? I think of people like John Steinbeck and Anton Chekhov because he is the master of the short story. You can get through a few of them sitting there in a few hours, and there's not a huge commitment with his characters, and you're not going to sit there with the big old Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Victorian kind of novel. So I realized, this guy, they say that he's part of an era where everything in Russia started to get more like depressing and cynical, because he's famous for being like one of those atheist, secular, cynical, scientific types. I mean, whoever the man was as a person is none of my business, but whether or not that's reflected in someone's art, I don't really know. And how are you judging that? By the subject matter? So I picked up this book, maybe you've heard of it. It's a famous collection called Ward Number 6, as in like a psych ward number 6, and Other Stories, by Anton Chekhov. Now, in this psych ward, there's a doctor called Dr. Ragin. I don't think it's pronounced Reagan, but Ragin, who's talking to a patient called Gromov. And Ragin is so interested in this patient, Gromov, that he keeps on visiting him. And they have deep philosophical discussions of a very Chekhovian nature. So if you don't mind, let's feel these lines build up in our mind and see if we can see an artist sculpting something in our mind and decide what kind of adult personality we're dealing with here. "Set me free," Gromov said, and his voice trembled. "I cannot." "Why not? Why ever not?" "Because it is not in my power. Just think for yourself. What good would it do if I released you? All right, go. The townspeople or the police will only arrest you and send you back here." No, I'm kidding. I'm not going to read it like that. Yes, that's true," Gromov murmured, rubbing his forehead. "It's terrible, but what can I do? What?" Ragin took a liking to Gromov's voice and his youthful, clever, grimacing face. He wanted to be kind to the young man and calm him down, so he sat beside him on the bed and thought for a moment. "You ask me what you can do," he said. "The best thing in your position would be to run away from here. But unfortunately, that's useless. You would be arrested. When society decides to protect itself from criminals, the mentally ill and undesirables in general, it is invincible. There's only one thing left. Console yourself with the thought that your stay here is necessary," the doctor says to the psych patient. "It's not necessary to anyone. Once prisons and lunatic asylums exist, someone has to live in them. If it isn't you, it will be me. If not me, then someone else. But you wait, in the distant future when prisons and asylums are no longer, there will be neither barred windows nor hospital smocks. Such a time is bound to come, sooner or later, of course. Gromov smiled sarcastically. You're joking, he said, screwing up his eyes. People like yourself and your assistant Nikita couldn't care less about the future. This is the patient talking. But you can rest assured, my dear sir, better times will come. What if I do express myself tritely? Yes, you may laugh, but one day the dawn of a new life will begin to glow. Truth will triumph and our day will come. I shan't live to see it. I'll have pegged out by then. But someone's great-grandchildren will. I salute them with all my heart and soul. I rejoice for them. Forward. May God help you, my friends. Gromov's eyes gleamed. He stood up and stretched his arms toward the window. I bless you from behind these bars, he continued, his voice quivering with emotion. Long live truth. I rejoice. I can see no particular reason for rejoicing, Ragin said, finding Gromov's gesticulations rather theatrical, but at the same time very pleasing. There will be no more prisons or asylums, and truth, as you choose to put it, will triumph, but the essence of things will not change. The law of nature will remain the same. People will fall ill, grow old, and die, just as now. However magnificent the dawn that will illumine your life, in the end you'll still be nailed down in your coffin and thrown into a pit. So this doctor's that kind of guy. What about immortality? Don't talk nonsense. You may not believe, but I do. Someone in Voltaire or Dostoevsky says that if there were no God, man would have invented him. But I strongly believe that if there's no immortality, man's powerful intellect will invent it sooner or later. Well said, replied Ragin, smiling with pleasure. It's good that you believe. With faith such as yours, you would be living in clover even if you were bricked up in a wall. Did you have a good education? Yes, I went to university, but I never graduated. You're a thoughtful, serious-minded man. You're the kind who would find peace of mind in any surroundings, unfettered, profound reflection that aspires to unravel the meaning of life, utter contempt for the vain bustle of this world. These are two blessings higher than which man has known nothing, and these you can possess, even if you lived behind 3 rows of bars. Diogenes lived in a tub, yet he was happier than all the monarchs of this world. Your Diogenes was a blockhead, Gromov gloomily intoned. Why do you keep telling me about Diogenes and some sort of comprehension of life, he said, suddenly flaring up and leaping to his feet. I love life. I love it passionately. I suffer from persecution mania, from a constant agonizing dread. But there are moments when I'm seized by a lust for life, and then I'm afraid I might go out of my mind. I long to live, oh so much. In great excitement he walked up and down the ward. What a daydream I have visions, he said, lowering his voice. Certain people come and visit me. I hear voices and music, and it seems as if I'm walking through some woods or along the seashore, and I have a terrible yearning for all the hustle and bustle. Tell me, what's the latest news? Gromov asked. What's going on? Do you mean in town or in general? First tell me about the town, then things in general. Well, what shall I tell you? It's excruciatingly boring in the town. No one to talk to, no one to listen. There are no new faces. But not so long ago, a young doctor by the name of Kobatov arrived. He arrived when I was still around. What's he like? A complete oaf? Yes, a bit of a Philistine. Do you know, it's a strange thing. By all accounts, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, there's no intellectual stagnation. Things are buzzing, so there must be real people there. But for some reason, they persist in sending us people who are pretty useless. It's an unlucky town. Yes, an unlucky town, Gromov sighed, and then burst out laughing. But how are things in general? What do the papers and magazines say? In the ward it was already dark. The doctor rose and, still standing, began to describe what was being written abroad and in Russia, and what the latest intellectual trends were. Gromov listened attentively and asked questions, but suddenly, as if he had remembered something awful, he clutched his head and threw himself on his bed with his back to the doctor. What's wrong? Ragin asked. That's all you're going to hear from me today, Gromov snapped. Leave me alone. But why? I'm telling you to leave me alone. To hell with it. Ragin shrugged his shoulders, sighed, and went out, As he passed through the lobby, he said, "I wonder if you wouldn't mind cleaning up a bit here, Nikita. There's a terrible smell." "Yes, sir." What a pleasant young man, thought Ragin as he returned to his lodgings. All the time I've been here, he's the first person I can really talk to. He can argue and he takes an interest in what really matters. After reading and going to bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Gromov. And when he awoke the next morning, he remembered that he had got to know an intelligent, interesting man. So he decided to pay him another visit at the first opportunity. And then the rest of the story is them going back and forth, and then eventually the doctor goes on a vacation to another country, and more things happen. But it's a great story. Now, there's another story about a woman called Ariadna. This one's maybe a little bit shorter, but it's pretty cool. We have to talk about a woman at least a little bit here. This one opens with a couple of men kind of shooting the breeze in a public place, and one man's talking about women and how we fall in love with them and how we pin our hopes and dreams on them and swoon over them. But after we get married, the illusion kind of fades. So he's kind of being a negative Nelly about that part of life. But I don't think it's as negative as it seems when a guy is talking about a girl that he met. Let's see, where do we start? Okay. The man talking, but the main thing is that he's talking about his own personal history, that I was deeply in love with a stunningly beautiful, charming girl. She was the sister of my neighbor, a bankrupt landowner by the name of Kotlovich. On his estate there were pineapples, amazing peaches, lightning conductors, a fountain in the middle of the courtyard, but at the same time he didn't have a kopeck to his name. He was a lazy, ignorant, limp character, seemingly fashioned from boiled turnip. He treated his sick peasants by homeopathy and dabbled in spiritualism. For all that, he was a gentle, sensitive kind of person and no fool. But I cannot stomach people who converse with spirits and treat peasant women with magnetism. Firstly, you always find these muddled ideas in people of limited intellectual horizons, and having a conversation with them is really hard going. In the second place, they don't normally fall in love, and they don't live with women, and this air of mystery tends to be disconcerting for impressionable people. Boy, you can write a short story about whatever you want, can't you? And I didn't like his appearance. He was tall, plump, white, with a small head, tiny sparkling eyes, and chubby white fingers. He didn't actually shake your hand, he kneaded it. Kneaded spelled with a K. And he was constantly apologizing. Whenever he asked for something, he'd say, "Sorry." If he gave you something again, "Sorry." As for his sister, she was quite another matter. I must point out that in my younger days I hadn't known the Kotloviches, since my father was a professor in N, and for a long time we lived in the provinces. But when I did get to know them, the girl was already 22. She had long left boarding school and had been living 2 or 3 years in Moscow with a rich aunt, who brought her out. When I met her and had my first talk with her, what struck me most of all was her unusual and beautiful name, Ariadna. It suited her so well. She was a brunette, very slim, lissom, shapely, extraordinarily graceful, with elegant, extremely refined features. She too had sparkling eyes, but whereas her brother's had a cold, sickly glint, like boiled sweets, hers were radiant with youth, beauty, and pride. I fell in love the very day we met, and it was inevitable. My first impressions were so powerful that to this day I still cannot rid myself of my illusions. I would still like to think that nature had some majestic, grandiose design in mind when she created that girl. Ariadna's voice, her walk, her hat, even the imprint of her feet on the sandy bank where she used to fish for gudgeon, filled me with joy and a passionate lust for life. Oh boy. Well, we all know what this is like. From Ariadna's beautiful face and figure I was able to judge her inner self, and her every word, her every smile captivated me and led me to suppose that hers was a noble soul. She was affectionate, talkative, cheerful, unaffected. Her belief in God was truly poetic, as were her thoughts on death, and her cast of mind was so rich with delicate nuances that she could make even her faults appear unique and endearing. Boy. But I think that, not that we're going to go into a whole Chekhov commentary here, but What is someone being overtly negative and talking about how all this is kind of an illusion, but later, how much of this is real, how much of it is illusion? We don't need to be so negative so pessimistic. Let's suppose she wanted a new horse but couldn't afford one. Well, so what? One could always sell or pawn something, and if the estate steward swore blindly that there was simply nothing to be pawned, then the iron roofs could be stripped off of the outbuildings and sent to the factory, or cart horses could be taken to a market at the busiest season and sold for a song. These wild impulses often reduced the whole estate to despair, but she expressed them with such refinement that in the end all was forgiven, all was allowed, as if she were a goddess or Caesar's wife. My love was truly touching, and before long everyone, my father, the neighbors, the peasants, was aware of it, and all of them sympathized with me. Whenever I treated the farm laborers to vodka, they would bow and say, "God grant that you marry Miss Kotelovich, master." Now, anyway, this is, yes, so it's Russian Literature Appreciation Week here at Boys Blees Publishing. And also what I'm going to do is play a little clip of this university lecture. If you've heard of this DVD series called The Great Courses, there's a guy who has a series of lectures on Russian literature, and there's one by Anton Chekhov that I think that has pieces that provide some insight, not just literary but historical context. So for now, I'll just have to say do svidaniya, I suppose.
Now, Anton Chekhov occupied a literary position really not very far from the traditionalists. Yet his prose and drama opened the way to very new ways of thinking about the theater, and in addition to that, the art of the short story. In just a few moments, when we take a look at particularly at his play, The Seagull, we'll see how he dealt with that kind of thing. Chekhov was born into a family that had known slavery intimately. His grandfather had been a serf. The writer openly stated that in his lifetime, he had to squeeze the slavery out of his blood slowly, deliberately, drop by drop. If this was the case in the life of a man who was as strong and well put together as Chekhov, imagine what it was for others to overcome the terrible legacy that was left by many centuries of years of slavery. Chekhov reflects this very clearly, and yet, at the same time, he also reflects a kind of strength that was in the people that enabled him to overcome what he was talking about, as he put it, drop by drop of blood. He was educated as a doctor, and he practiced medicine for a good part of his life. In his approach to his characters, it's not hard to see the detached and observant eyes of the medical examiner. In an early part of his life, while still in medical school, he was saddled with the responsibility of supporting his brothers and sisters. He wrote light, humorous stories under the pseudonym of Chechonte. He did this mainly to get money for the support of his very needy brothers and sisters, but at the same time began to develop a certain style. In the beginning, you might call it almost a form of, humor you'd find on the vaudeville stage. As he went on and began to get experiences and think ever more deeply about what he was writing, the writing became deeper and deeper. He eventually grew to be the Chekhov that we know, the man of international fame. When he'd achieved certain popularity among the reading public, he started to write stories of greater substance and developed into the Chekhov we now know not only today but throughout the world. As I say, that's the Chekhov that we know. However, in the West, especially in England and the United States, that is the English-speaking world, his greatest reputation is that of a playwright. I don't think it would be an exaggeration to call him an icon, if not the god, of the modern international theater. It's almost impossible to imagine contemporary theater that doesn't deal with Chekhov in some way or another. Of course, this is well borne out if you go to the drama schools of America today. They're just loaded with the thought and experimentation and acting and all those things that you find in the presentations by Chekhov's plays, which are very subtle and not so easy to do. It takes a very subtle understanding to catch the characters that Chekhov tried to present them. As early as the 1880s, Chekhov had tried his hand at writing plays, but they didn't become widely known at that particular time. However, in 1895, he set to work on what's called in Russian Chaika, or the Seagull, which was fated to become one of the best-known plays of its time and a formative drama of 20th century theater. I don't think it's an exaggeration to call it that. I would even be willing to predict it'll be a formative drama in 21st century theater as well. However, its first performance in a traditional Petersburg theater in late 1895 was a total flop. Chekhov was mercilessly raked over the coals by the well-known critics of the day, and the sensitive man swore he would never write for the theater again. Obviously, the Petersburg theater didn't understand what Chekhov was trying to do, because what he was trying to do was so tremendously different from anything they had done before. They simply didn't understand it, or as we say, and here I like to use a slang word, they didn't dig it, a good word to use in the theater among actors. The result was a mess, which the critics lambasted, I suppose would be fair to say, with fire and sword. Now Chekhov, although he's very popular in this part of the world as a playwright, was not only a playwright, he was also the writer of a series of prose stories, some of which are very moving. Furthermore, his stories don't seem to exhibit what we normally tend to think of as characteristic of Russian stories. They're short, they're brief, they make their point in a very short amount of time. We're not talking about long novels that go on for hundreds of pages. Some stories are only 3 or 4 pages, but what Chekhov manages to get across is something very powerful. A good example of Chekhov's art in this way, although a slightly longer story, is a story whose title is usually translated as The Darling. In Russian, the title is Dushechka, which literally means little soul. This is a good example of Russian diminutives. The word for soul is dusha. This is Dushechka, dear little soul, is often used as a term of endearment like darling or sweetheart in English. Readers have taken it to refer to the famous Greek legend around Psyche, whose name is the Greek word for soul. This tale has often been interpreted, that is Chekhov's tale, has often been interpreted as a representation of the dangers in combining the force of eros with the force of the soul. In Chekhov's tale, a lady named Olga is first presented as the wife of a theater manager who is eternally nervous about getting sufficient audiences to support his enterprise. He's always yelling, "Strashly ubытki, horrible losses, horrible financial losses." Her every thought is devoted to the theater, and her kindness and sweetness causes everyone to call her Dushechka. The theater manager is terribly upset. People won't come to his play. He did Faust inside out, whatever that means, by the way. But no matter what he does, people won't come. He's experiencing strashny ubытki, terrible losses. Alas, he dies. Of course, when he dies, Olga is no longer attached to the theater, and nobody calls her Dushechka anymore. But soon enough, she's courted by a lumber merchant who then marries her. And now she says, "So what's so good about that theater anyway? It's just a bunch of senseless vaudeville. The only important things in the world are the details connected with the manufacture and sale of lumber." She knows how to say plywood and oakwood and all the technical things that go together with lumber. And she can't imagine a time when she was connected with that superficial thing called theater. And everyone calls her Dushechka. They come to her place to have baranki. I like to say the Russian form of bagels, but my Russian friends say they're not. And bublichki, and all the wonderful things that are connected with a boiling samovar and a good hot cup of tea. Well, alas, the lumber merchant also dies. And again, nobody calls her Dushechka. There's a wonderful little intermezzo in the story where she sits, and because she's not connected with anybody, she has no opinions whatsoever. And what a terrible thing it is not to have any opinions at all about anything in this world. And the reader is almost lulled, perhaps to sleep by this. But now, lo and behold, a veterinarian comes to her. Soon she takes up with the veterinarian, and soon she's talking about diseases of animals and their problems and what she'd have to do to keep the cattle and pets alive and how very good veterinarians are for the animal world and the human world. And again, everybody calls her Dushechka. The veterinarian is no fool. He knows that the 2 previous men that had been connected to this woman had died. There's something about her that seems to bring on death. So he leaves, and she loses all interest in life. No opinion whatsoever, and one can again understand how painful it is, and no one calls her Dushechka. But happily, The veterinarian returns, this time with his wife and child. He had taken up with her before, but obviously not married her. She rejoices, puts him up in a wing of her house, and takes over the care of the child with all its attendant worries and problems. And once more, people call her Dushechka. At the end of the story, the child goes off to school. She follows me. He says, look, Auntie, don't follow me. I want to go on my own. He comes home, and the two of them worry over his homework. Oh, my God, what is an island? An island is a body of land completely surrounded by water. How difficult it is to learn. How hard they are on the young people. Oh, these poor young people, she says, they have such hard things to learn. She reverberates to every feeling of the young child. As a matter of fact, at the end of the story, he's a real kid. We hear the stirring. He says, get out of my way. He's stirring in his sleep. He's dreaming. Get out of my way. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to get into a fight. Watch out, watch out. She sits there just praying and exulting in the fact she's once more connected with a human being. By the way, Tolstoy did not like Chekhov's plays very much. And he would tell him, he would talk to Chekhov, whose name and patronymic was Anton Pavlovich. He said, Anton Pavlovich, I love you very much. You're a wonderful man, and I love your stories. But your plays, they're impossibly bad. They're worse than Shakespeare's. Tolstoy couldn't stand Shakespeare. Maybe he was out of professional jealousy, but then again, maybe he felt there was too much violence. In any case, this same Tolstoy interpreted the story I've just told you about as a retelling of the biblical tale of Balaam, the priest of a people who stood in the way of the people of Israel on its journey out of Egypt toward the Promised Land. These people, that is, who were meeting the people of Israel, were getting rather nervous about meeting them because rumors have been going around that they've been conquering people here, they've been conquering people there. The people of Israel seem to have some extraordinary force on their side. Of course, the Israelites claimed it was God. So in order to neutralize this force, Balaam, the prophet of the people, was ordered to go out and pronounce a curse on the people of Israel. He went out on his donkey. As a matter of fact, the donkey had sense enough to try and stop him. But he beat the donkey, so the donkey, in order to avoid the beating, went ahead. Balaam came out to proclaim a curse. He opened his mouth, and instead of a curse, out came a blessing. What the devil's going on? I meant to curse, and a blessing came out of my mouth? He went back. He reinforced himself. Again, he went out on the donkey. Again, the donkey didn't want to go out. And again, he beat the donkey. And again, he tried to pronounce a curse, and out came a blessing. He did it a third time, and again, he tried to curse, and out came a blessing. Finally, he understood, and this is biblical language, it was impossible to curse those whom the Lord God had blessed. Tolstoy said that Chekhov in the story was like Balaam. He had intended to make Olga Dushechka, a comic character with her light-minded adoption of different professions. But the result was only a demonstration of the power of love. She became Dushechka, that is, a living soul, only when she was deeply in love with another person. And the power of that all-giving love was the highest mark of humanity. In short, as Tolstoy points out, and of course as the Bible implies, true love is blind. It gives itself to those whose feelings arouse our feelings and to whose love we respond with our love.